Matteo Ricci was only 12 years old, yet to him, the blazing red marks on his test papers felt like knives carving deep into his flesh. On the intricately carved walnut desk in the study room of the family villa by the Grand Canal, the test sheets lay scattered, each bearing a giant, blotchy F, like dried bloodstains. That crumpled pile wasn't just evidence of academic failure. It was the chain that bound his fragile childhood, forcing him to live in constant fear. The Ricci family's Venice villa was lavish to excess. Polished marble floors, ceilings adorned with delicate frescoes, and crystal chandeliers casting golden light across vast halls. Everything radiated wealth, power, and pride. And yet, in this world, Matteo felt like an outsider, suffocating in a cold, gilded cage. He sat in a daze, blonde hair falling across his forehead, small shoulders trembling, gripping a pencil like a dagger to fend off some invisible enemy. The letters before him danced, jumbled, and broke apart into distorted shapes he couldn't piece together. The door burst open. Lorenzo Ricci, Matteo's father, entered tall, imposing, clad in a sharply tailored suit from Milan, his gaze as cold as a man used to issuing commands. In his hand was a test sheet smeared with red ink. He held it aloft like a courtroom indictment and spoke in a voice as hard as steel, reverberating through the room. Useless. You're not worthy of the Ricci name. The words fell heavy, like a hammer striking iron. To Lorenzo, building a real estate empire across Europe was proof of strength and intellect. He believed his only son had to inherit that same cold-blooded power. He did not tolerate weakness, and even less so, failure. To him, every F was not a child's mistake, but an insult to the Ricci family's honor. Matteo didn't cry. He was too used to that voice, too used to the icy look of disappointment in his father's eyes. He lowered his head, gripping the pencil until his fingers turned red, though his eyes showed numb sorrow. Behind his father, the household staff bowed their heads silently. They whispered behind closed doors that the young master was nothing like his father. Perhaps Matteo was the shame of the Ricci lineage. That night, as the sounds of waves and distant church bells filled the Venetian air, Matteo sat quietly by his bedroom window. On the bed behind him, trophies and prestigious certificates, all bought by his father from elite schools and auctions, were stacked high, as cold as lifeless statues. He clutched a crumpled test paper, the blazing red F still burning in his eyes. He whispered hoarsely, not with anger, not in rebellion, just exhausted. Maybe I am broken. In that gold-gilded room, in a world where everything shimmered, only Matteo's heart remained heavy and dark, and the boy had no idea that the very next morning, fate would open a completely different door. A woman ordinary and unassuming would enter through the servant's entrance, bringing with her a light that not even millions of euros could ever buy. That morning in Venice, dawn dyed the canal waters in glimmering gold. While Matteo's father had already left in his car for the company office in Milan, and the servants bustled about preparing a lavish breakfast in the grand hall, a woman quietly entered through the staff entrance. Isabella Conti, 34, had just been hired as a housemaid. Petite in stature, with sun-kissed olive skin, her dark brown eyes held something firm and gentle. Her hair was tied back under an old blue cloth scarf, and her worn-out shoes made soft, slapping sounds on the polished marble floor. In her hand was a scuffed leather bag, its corners frayed, but inside it lay keepsakes and methods passed down by her late mother, things she never imagined would one day change the fate of a noble child. In the kitchen, two chefs were busy chopping vegetables and stirring pans, chatting under their breath. The new one, huh? She looks so frail, I give her a few weeks. Yeah. That Matteo kid's a nightmare. Even the best tutors quit. What's she got to hope for? They chuckled, not noticing Isabella had heard every word. But she didn't react. Life had taught her that mockery was often just a shell for ignorance. Instead of responding, she quietly set down her bag, arranged her belongings neatly, and began cleaning with a precision that resembled ritual. While dusting the villa's library that afternoon, Isabella heard a strange sound, a pencil scraping angrily across paper, labored breathing, then a soft, desperate growl. She stopped. Through the slightly ajar door, she saw Matteo. The boy was slumped over his desk, face flushed, his tousled blonde hair falling over his brow, hand trembling as he held his pencil. Each time he tried to write a line in his workbook, The letters twisted, distorted, and he would crumple the page and toss it into the corner. The desk was piled with balled-up sheets, like a battlefield littered with the corpses of blank paper. His eyes were frantic, tears threatening to spill but held back by a brittle pride. Isabella stood frozen. Her heart ached. She had seen that look before in herself. A poor little girl from Calabria, called stupid by teachers because she couldn't read, mocked by classmates, and only her aging mother patiently sat by her side, teaching her letters by drawing shapes in the air and whispering, "They don't hate you, dear. You see them differently. We'll find the rhythm that fits you." The memory rushed back, tightening Isabella's throat. She couldn't just stand there. She stepped lightly into the room, her footsteps so soft that Matteo didn't notice at first when he looked up and saw a new maid, his face immediately tensed, his eyes wary as if bracing for another sigh of disappointment or a cutting remark. But instead, Isabella smiled, a light, warm smile like the last sun of the day. She spoke softly, her voice laced with the gentle cadence of southern Italy. "You're holding the pencil like a sword. No wonder the page is fighting back." Matteo froze. No one, especially not an adult, had ever spoken to him like that. Not a command, not a scolding, but something else entirely. He didn't reply, just stared wide-eyed. Isabella didn't come closer. She picked up a paper from the floor, smoothed it, and placed it back on the desk. Then she turned away, resumed dusting the bookshelf, quietly humming an old folk tune. Matteo watched her. Something inside him shifted. He didn't yet understand why, but Isabella's words echoed in his mind all evening. No wonder the page is fighting back. That night, for the first time in months, the boy did not cry himself to sleep. The next day, the atmosphere in the mansion remained heavy. News of yet another tutor quitting spread throughout the kitchen and hallways. The servants whispered. Another one ran off. "That boy is a curse. The master must be furious. I heard he's planning to send him to a boarding school in Switzerland." "Yes. That place doesn't tolerate weakness." "Poor kid, but what can you do?" Matteo overheard them from the staircase. His heart tightened. The phrase boarding school sounded like a sentence of exile. In his imagination, it wasn't a school, a gilded prison, where failed children were abandoned so they wouldn't tarnish the family's reputation. Matteo sat in his room that night, clutching a test paper crossed with red marks. The light from his desk lamp cast sunken shadows across his face. He whispered, "Maybe I am broken. If I were smart, it wouldn't be like this." His father's words, the pitying glances from the staff, they all pierced him like knives. At just 12 years old, in a villa gilded with gold, he felt smaller and more worthless than anyone out there. But while Matteo surrendered to despair, Isabella was still washing crystal glasses in the kitchen. The candlelight reflecting on the water reminded her of her difficult childhood, the days when rain beat against their crooked house, and a tiny girl struggled to read, always lagging behind her classmates. If not for her mother, she too might have been abandoned like Matteo. The next day, while cleaning near the study, Isabella again heard the sound of a pencil clattering, then Matteo's ragged breathing. The boy had his head down, cheeks flushed with frustration. Another sheet of paper was crumpled in defeat. Isabella stepped into the room this time, not just to observe. She picked up the pencil, placed it gently back on the desk, and asked softly, "Have you ever tried listening to the letters instead of looking at them?" Matteo frowned, confused. Isabella sat beside him and pulled the book closer. She pointed to a line, then read it slowly, enunciating each syllable, letting the sounds ripple like waves. Then she nodded, gesturing for him to repeat. At first, Matteo stammered. The letters jumbled, sounds distorted. His face flushed with shame. He pushed the book aside. "See? I can't do it. I'm broken." Isabella straightened her back, eyes calm as she looked at him. Her voice was low, but steady. "No, you're not broken. You see the world in a different rhythm. My mother once told me that, and she was right." Matteo was stunned. It was the first time someone neither denied nor pitied his struggle, but acknowledged the pain as truth. Isabella traced letters in the air with her finger, then had Matteo do the same. Without pressure, she let him write on the desk's surface with his fingertip. She whispered each sound, turning language into melody. And then a minor miracle. Matteo stammered, but this time he finished the sentence slowly, shakily, but clearly enough to be understood. He blinked, eyes wide, then a faint smile crept across his face, one he hadn't felt in so long. I did it. he said, as if he couldn't believe his ears. Isabella smiled, tapped gently on the desk. See, they don't hate you. You just needed to make them follow your rhythm. That night, Matteo held the book in his arms as he lay in bed, reading and rereading the sentence he had managed to say out loud. To him, it wasn't just a line of text, it was proof that he wasn't as useless as the world had claimed. Rumors spread quickly through the mansion. In the kitchen, over the scent of toasted bread and coffee, the staff once again gathered to whisper, "The new maid. Seems like she's teaching the young master? Really? That's bold. Even the best tutors failed. What makes her different? She'll be fired soon. You'll see. No one here stands up to the master." The dry laughter that followed sliced through the already heavy air like blades. Isabella heard it all while washing dishes, but smiled quietly. She knew these whispers weren't really about her. They came from the fear these people carried inside. She hadn't come here to prove anything to them. She saw herself in Matteo, the same child she had been 15 years ago, eyes swollen red from staring at dancing, defiant letters. And she knew, if anyone could understand him, it was her. In the following days, Isabella began appearing in the study room at precisely 4 p.m. when the usual tutors had long given up and gone. Matteo no longer avoided her. He sat at the desk, waiting, pencil freshly sharpened, his eyes still cautious, but now filled with a quiet hope. The lessons began with the smallest steps, writing single letters on the blackboard, sounding out syllables slowly, circling keywords with chalk. Sometimes Matteo slammed the desk in frustration or crumpled papers with clenched fists. But Isabella never scolded him. She would rest her hand on his shoulder and say gently, "See, it's not your fault. We must find a way for the letters to listen to you." And so, they tried again. Once, twice, 10 times. On some days, Matteo broke into tears, burying his head in his arms. Isabella would sit beside him, offering no lectures, only softly humming the old lullabies her mother used to sing. Eventually, he would calm down, pick up his pencil again, and try to read one more line. In the hallway, some servants peeked in and shrugged. "The young master seems different lately. Is he smiling? Strange. I've never seen him smile while studying before." The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Matteo began carrying books, no longer hiding them under his pillow. He scribbled letters onto napkins, even tried whispering words to himself while walking in the garden. Every step, however small, felt like a lantern lit within a once cold mansion. One evening, after reading a whole short paragraph aloud, Matteo burst into laughter. "I won, Isabella. They can't say I'm useless anymore." Isabella clapped gently, her eyes glowing with joy and pride. But in her heart, a quiet worry had crept in. When Lorenzo found out, how would he react? Upstairs in his study, Lorenzo continued signing thick contracts, unaware that below him, the son he had written off as worthless was slowly being revived by the hands of a woman society considered beneath him. A door was about to open, one that would lead to a confrontation no one could have foreseen. One autumn morning, sunlight streamed through the giant glass windows of the study room, casting golden rays across the pages of an open book. Matteo was struggling to reread a familiar passage. This time, instead of frowning, he murmured along softly, each letter no longer twisted and chaotic. Isabella sat across from him, still holding her dustcloth, but her eyes were filled with quiet patience, tracking every small step forward. Suddenly, the door burst open. Lorenzo entered, a perfectly tailored suit, tightly knotted tie, and a sharp, cold gaze that swept the entire room. In his hand was a stack of Matteo's latest school papers, bright red markings slashed across the pages like wounds. "Another failure," he said, his voice cold as steel. Matteo flinched. His hand trembled, dropping the pencil. He quickly bent down to pick it up, hiding the small smile that had just begun to bloom a few minutes earlier. Lorenzo glanced briefly at Isabella, his brow furrowing. "And you? Why are you sitting here? Your job is to clean, not waste time pretending to be a tutor." The air thickened, silent enough to hear the ticking clock. Isabella stood straight, still gripping the cloth, but her gaze did not waver. "Sir, I saw the boy needed someone beside him, and sometimes letters must be read slowly for him to understand." Lorenzo let out a cold, mocking laugh. You think you're better than the specialists I've hired from London, Paris, Geneva. They all gave up. You're just a maid, don't delude yourself. Matteo stood still, heart pounding wildly in his chest. He wanted to scream that Isabella was the only one who made him believe he wasn't broken. But fear of his father wrapped around his tongue like chains. Isabella took a deep breath, then bowed her head slightly. I'm not comparing myself to anyone, sir, but I've been where the boy is. And if I'm wrong, you can dismiss me. Just give me more time. A little more. Lorenzo paused for a few seconds, eyes narrowing, as if measuring her audacity. He slammed the test papers onto the table, making Matteo flinch. Time? I've given that boy 12 years, and in return this pile of red marks. He pointed at Matteo, his voice low and hard. If there's no progress, I'll send him to boarding school in Switzerland. They don't tolerate weakness there. Matteo felt his heart drop into a dark pit. Boarding school. Far from home. Far from Isabella. Far from the only light, just beginning to flicker. Isabella glanced at the boy and saw his trembling lips. His eyes rimmed red. She knew if Lorenzo decided alone, Matteo would be buried in a loneliness far crueler than failure. She stepped forward toward the desk, her voice steady. Give me 3 months. If the boy doesn't change, I'll leave willingly, without complaint. The room froze. Lorenzo stared at her. In his eyes, surprise mixed with irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a maid. But perhaps that very steel in her voice made him pause. Finally, Lorenzo turned away, leaving only one sentence behind. 3 months. Don't make me regret it. The door slammed shut. Matteo exhaled deeply, clutching his book as if afraid it would disappear. He whispered to Isabella, voice so low only she could hear. You won't leave me, right? Isabella placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes unwavering. No, Matteo. I promised my mother I would never let a child feel abandoned like I once did, and I intend to keep that promise. In that moment, a fragile but brilliant trust sparked to life. Matteo no longer saw Isabella as just a maid, but as his only ally in the cold world that surrounded him. 3 months. That number hung over both of them like a suspended sentence. Lorenzo never mentioned it again, but Matteo knew his father would not hesitate to send him to Switzerland if he failed. And in that white stone mansion, silence became a race against time. Every afternoon, after the heavy footsteps of Lorenzo faded down the hallway, Matteo would secretly wait for Isabella in the study. The room, with its towering walls of books and polished wooden desk, became their secret haven. Isabella started with the smallest of steps. She didn't force Matteo to read long passages like the tutors before her had done. Instead, she wrote each letter in white chalk on a small slate, letting Matteo trace each line with his finger. Letters aren't enemies, she whispered. They just want to be heard in a rhythm you can understand. Matteo tried clumsily at first, chalk lines crooked and unsure. But Isabella's eyes never showed frustration or impatience. On the contrary, every mistake became a game. See? The letter B looks like 2 balls stuck together. Try imagining them rolling. The boy giggled, a rare sound in a villa accustomed only to echoing footsteps and scolding voices. Day after day, the lessons became a mosaic of patience. Some days, Matteo grew tired, throwing his pencil to the floor, shouting, I can't do it, I'm so stupid. Isabella sat beside him, saying nothing elaborate. She opened her old cloth bag and pulled out a yellowed sheet of paper. It was a page from a school notebook, slanted handwriting, ink smudged. Do you know who wrote this? She asked. Matteo shook his head. It was me when I was your age. All bad grades, thinking I'd be stupid forever. But my mother sat with me every night, teaching me letter by letter, sound by sound, until things made sense. I wouldn't be sitting here today if not for her. Matteo was silent, staring at the paper, the messy handwriting, the smeared ink. To him, it was proof that Isabella had once walked out of the same darkness he was in. That night, as Matteo climbed into bed, he pulled out a new notebook and slowly wrote the first 3 letters instead of burying his head under the pillow like usual. Not perfect, but enough to make him smile. Rumors spread through the kitchen. Servants whispered, "What is she doing to make the boy study so hard?" Heard the little one even smiled during lessons. Never seen that before. Someone scoffed, "It'll pass. If the master finds out, they will be out on the street." Isabella heard it all, but didn't care. She knew the real battle hadn't even begun. One evening, Matteo read an entire short paragraph. Slow, halting, but fluent. He set the book down, eyes shimmering, lips trembling. "Miss, I did it, didn't I?" Isabella nodded, saying nothing more, just reaching out her hand. Matteo touched it, as if grasping a lifeline in a raging current. The mansion no longer felt like a prison of failure at that moment. It became a place where a 12-year-old boy first believed he might win. The second month passed, and within the Castelvecchio estate, a quiet transformation occurred. Matteo no longer hid in the shadows, tore his notebooks to stuff under his pillow. He began sitting properly at his desk, waiting for Isabella to walk in with her warm smile. But it was precisely this change that caught the attention of Lorenzo, his father. One afternoon, returning from the office earlier than usual, Lorenzo unintentionally overheard the sound of reading from the study. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, he saw Matteo sitting and reading aloud a passage, with Isabella by his side, pointing at each word, her voice calm and patient. Lorenzo stood motionless. In that brief moment, a flicker passed through his eyes. The son he had once considered hopeless was now trying, seriously. But instead of being moved, he frowned. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was ice cold. Matteo flinched, hastily covering the book. Isabella tilted her head slightly, her voice composed. "Sir, I was only helping the boy a little." "You are a maid, not a tutor," Lorenzo said sharply. "I've paid thousands of euros to top specialists who all failed, and you think you can accomplish something?" Isabella lowered her gaze, but her voice did not tremble. "There are things money cannot buy, sir. The boy doesn't need more scolding. He needs someone patient enough to listen." Lorenzo clenched his fists, eyes cold as steel. But then Matteo suddenly stood up, trembling, and said, "Father, I want her to teach me. For the first time, I feel the letters don't hate me anymore." The room fell into silence. Lorenzo looked at his son, the bright blue eyes flashing a resistance he had never seen before. A strange emotion stirred inside him, part anger, part confusion. He turned his back and left, the door slamming shut with a thud that echoed through the hallway. The news spread quickly through the mansion. Servants whispered excitedly. The maid confronted the master right in the study. "Crazy, she's surely going to get fired soon." But Isabella carried on. The more she was challenged, the more resolute she became. Every evening, when Matteo grew tired, she would tell him stories of her childhood, of a dark-skinned girl in a small village who was mocked by teachers, but learned to love letters thanks to her mother. Matteo listened, captivated. For the first time, he felt he was not alone. One night, while Lorenzo sat alone in his study, looking over a pile of contracts, his gaze fell upon Matteo's old exercise book. This time, the handwriting was no longer messy but neat and deliberate. His heart faltered, but then he shook his head, telling himself, nothing more than a stroke of luck. Weakness can't be fixed with such childish tricks. What he didn't know was that his doubt was about to become a harsh test, a challenge determining whether Matteo's fragile belief and Isabella's quiet persistence could survive the weight of power and pride. On an early weekday morning, the sky over Milan was gray, with a drizzle brushing against the expansive windows of the Castelvecchio estate. Matteo sat in the study, patiently writing each letter as Isabella gently guided him. The desk lamp's glow reflected on his unusually focused face. Isabella was softly reading a short paragraph in Italian when the door suddenly swung open. Lorenzo stepped in, followed by a well-dressed man holding a thick stack of documents. "This is Mr. Ricci, the education specialist I invited." Lorenzo's voice echoed through the room. "Today, there will be a surprise test. I want to see whether this maid's patience has produced any results." The air froze. Matteo turned pale, his hand trembling as he held the pencil. His mind immediately flashed back to old memories tests that always ended in glaring red Fs, followed by his father's cold stare. Isabella gently placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice quiet but steady. "It's okay, Matteo. Breathe. Remember how we practiced." Lorenzo folded his arms and leaned against the bookshelf, his gaze as sharp as a blade. He wanted to witness failure firsthand, to prove his belief was correct, that there was no miracle for weakness. Mr. Ricci sat down across from Matteo and placed the paper before him. "This will include reading comprehension and writing. You have 30 minutes." Matteo swallowed hard, His eyes blurred. The letters began swirling again, spinning and dancing. His heart pounded. Sweat broke out. "I can't do this," Matteo whispered. Isabella immediately leaned closer, softly whispering into his ear. "Remember what I taught you. Don't look at the whole line. See one word at a time. Don't fear its rhythm, let it sing to your beat." Matteo closed his eyes, picturing Isabella's mother's hand, drawing letters in the air, an image Isabella had described many times. He began reading slowly, word by word. His voice trembled at first, but gradually grew steadier. Lorenzo frowned. He wasn't used to seeing his son dare to read aloud in front of others. When it came to the writing portion, Matteo took a deep breath. His small fingers gripped the pencil tightly, and he wrote each letter on the page slow, clear, and neat. Whenever he hesitated, he recalled Isabella's gentle smile and her whispered words. "It's okay. Even mistakes are steps forward." Time passed under heavy tension. When the clock struck exactly 30 minutes, Mr. Ricci collected the test. He flipped through the pages, his eyes gradually widening. Finally, he looked up at Lorenzo. "Mr. Castelvecchio, this is not the work of a failing child. This is evident progress." The boy read the passage fluently, and most of the writing is correct. If he continues like this, he could catch up with peers his age in just a few months. A brief silence blanketed the room. Matteo looked at his father, his eyes glistening with hope, waiting for praise, a smile, or at least recognition. But Lorenzo just stood there, his face clouded, his hands clenched as if battling himself. Finally, he growled, "It's just luck. One instance doesn't mean anything. Don't let pride fool you." The words poured over like ice water. But unlike before, Matteo didn't cry. He lowered his head, then quietly turned to Isabella. In his eyes now wasn't despair, it was belief. Isabella placed her hand on the test paper and smiled faintly. Her eyes shone with determination. This battle was far from over. Outside the window, Milan's drizzle began to fade, revealing a clear blue sky, as if signaling that change was coming, even if Lorenzo still refused to see it. In the days following the test, the atmosphere inside the Castelvecchio estate felt heavier than ever. News of Matteo almost entirely reading and writing spread through the kitchen, hallways, and servant quarters. But instead of joy, most of the staff scoffed, whispering that it was nothing more than a rare accident, a stroke of luck. "If that rich young master turns out smart, then the sun must be rising in the west," muttered an old maid while scrubbing shining silver dishes. "That new maid is just fooling herself. The master knows well that the boy will never rise above," added another, voice laced with mockery. Those whispers accidentally reached Matteo's ears. Pitiful and skeptical eyes followed him whenever he walked past the kitchen or garden. They didn't need to say it, Matteo could hear it clearly. The useless boy. One evening, Lorenzo sat in his study, pouring red wine into a crystal glass. His eyes stared into the fireplace, flames casting light over his cold face. Before he laid the final plan, he had to send Matteo to a strict boarding school in Switzerland. The red seal of the institution stood boldly in the corner of the paper. "Perhaps only a place like that can forge him," Lorenzo murmured. "A fire harsh enough to burn away weakness." Isabella's heart sank when she overheard the news from the butler. She knew clearly if Matteo were sent away, all his efforts would be crushed under inhumane pressure. He would be belittled again, and he would fall again. That night, Matteo sat in his room, hugging his notebook. He whispered to himself, "If father doesn't believe, then I have to prove it. But am I strong enough?" Isabella walked in. The glow of the night lamp spilled across the boy's face. She gently sat down at the edge of his bed, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Listen, Piccolo," she called him by the affectionate Italian nickname, her voice full of warmth. "Others may not believe, but you've already seen it yourself. You read. You write. You don't have to become someone else to be worthy. You have to be yourself." Matteo looked at her, eyes red and swollen. "But father will never see it that way. He wants a perfect son, not a boy. Like me." Isabella took a deep breath, holding back tears. She touched the notebook and flipped to the page where Matteo had written his first complete sentence. "Perfection doesn't define a person, Matteo. Heart and perseverance do. You're not a burden. You're living proof that no one is born to be labeled useless." Her words pierced through the thick darkness. Matteo stayed silent, then slowly nodded. A small flame flickered in his chest, not bright, but warm enough to keep him going. Meanwhile, Lorenzo grew increasingly frustrated at seeing his son grow attached to Isabella. He believed the maid was planting illusions in Matteo's mind, and Lorenzo Castelvecchio would not allow anyone to challenge his authority, not even a nameless maid. He gave orders to the butler. If within the next month he doesn't show precise results at school, I will send him away immediately. And that maid, if I find her interfering, she will disappear from this estate. That declaration now hung like a suspended sentence over both Matteo and Isabella. But Lorenzo didn't realize that his cruelty was unintentionally pulling the two closer, binding them like a shared front against prejudice and harshness. As the Castelvecchio estate slept that night, Matteo sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall over the rose garden. In his mind, two contrasting voices echoed, his father's cold, useless, and Isabella's warm whisper, "You're not broken." Between those two voices, the 2-year-old boy knew. He had to choose which belief to walk forward with. The fateful morning arrived quicker than Matteo had expected. His school was holding the final exam, a judgment that would decide whether he stayed at Castelvecchio or be exiled to Switzerland by his father. The whole estate bustled with activity, but Matteo's room was silent. He sat at his desk, hands trembling around the pen. Isabella stood quietly behind him, her gaze gentle yet resolute. "Remember what we practiced," she said, her voice as warm and steady as a lullaby. "Each word, each breath. You're not fighting this alone." Matteo took a deep breath. He bent over the blank page, and for the first time, the letters were no longer enemies. They still danced and teased, but he knew how to catch their rhythm. Each sentence appeared, trembling but clear, as if he were opening a door that had been locked since childhood. When the exam ended, Matteo walked out of the classroom, clutching the paper tightly. The teacher stared at the results, lips stammering in disbelief. This can't be. This boy has made astounding progress." The news spread quickly and soon reached Lorenzo. He sat behind his desk, the test sheet lying before him. Eyes used to scanning million-euro contracts now stared, stunned, at the bold letter in the corner. A perfect A, not charity, not an inflated score. He looked at Matteo, who stood trembling before him, but this time with his head held high, eyes gleaming. The boy said nothing, turned toward the door where Isabella stood quietly, still holding a silver polishing cloth in her hand. The room fell silent. Lorenzo leaned back, his eyes shifting from surprise to confusion, then stopped at Isabella. In that moment, power, money, and status shrank to insignificance. Standing before him was a mere housemaid who had done what countless renowned tutors and experts could not. "How?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Matteo didn't answer. Isabella bowed her head, her gaze humble yet proud. "By listening, sir," she said. "As long as someone believes the boy isn't broken, he'll find his light." Her words echoed through the large room, striking a truth Lorenzo had never dared face: his cruelty. He was silent for a long time. Then, for the first time, Lorenzo Castelvecchio spoke in a softened tone. "You will no longer be a floor cleaner. From now on, you are my son's official tutor. Teach him your way." Matteo whipped around to Isabella, eyes brimming with tears. Unable to hold back, he ran and embraced her tightly. Isabella froze, then wrapped her arms around the boy, her shoulders trembling with emotion. From that day on, the Castelvecchio estate changed. The once heavy hallways now echoed with childlike laughter. Matteo no longer hid his tests under pillows or tucked notebooks in drawers. He pinned them proudly on the bulletin board pages filled with letters, sometimes crooked, sometimes flawed, but each one a victory. The staff no longer gossiped. Instead, they whispered in awe. The boy's changed. No, he didn't change. He was seen in the right light. As for Lorenzo, though never a man comfortable with emotions, there was one time, passing the library, he caught his son reading fluently from a book. He stood frozen for a long moment. A faint smile briefly crossed a face usually locked in scowls. Isabella knew the road ahead would still be long. Matteo would stumble and face days when the letters whirled like a storm. But now, he was no longer alone. And more importantly, he knew he was not broken. The story of Matteo and Isabella didn't end within the marble walls of Castelvecchio. It became proof of a simple but powerful truth. Patience and belief can achieve what money and power never could. Because sometimes, just one person daring to believe in you when the whole world turns away, is enough to rewrite your destiny.